and welcome back to Property Matters on Dublin South FM and on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Talon. You can contact us on social media at iPropertyRadio or email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. Joining us this week is John McCartney, Director and Head of Research at BNP Paribas Real Estate Ireland, and of course a returning guest to the show. We rely on John to keep us up to date on many facets of the market. John, welcome back and Happy New Year to you.
Likewise to you, Carol, and thanks for having me back on the show.
I'm delighted because, you know, coming into the new year, it's always an interesting time to reflect on the 12 months that have passed and maybe to look and see what kind of trends can we expect for the 12 months ahead of us. And certainly in almost 2 decades in the market, including the time of the crash, I mean, certainly in the last decade, the market, you know, when we talk about different markets converging and different influences and factors converging to influence the market, I just can't remember a more confused time. Is that a fair reading of the situation?
Well, there's a lot going on, Carol, and I find in my own mind, at least, it helps to try and think it helps me to try and think of things by separating out the structural and the cyclical, you know. And if we take, for example, the Dublin office market, there are clearly structural issues at play. So we have this legacy of COVID, which is the, that mass transition to remote working, and now the gradual unwinding of that. And there is, I think, an open question as to whether there has been a permanent behaviour shift, and if so, to what extent will service sector employees come back to work in the office on a sort of a full-time or semi-full-time basis. So that's clearly a structural issue. And then equally, we have very pronounced cyclical issues, I think, or quite pronounced cyclical issues at the moment. On the supply side, we have had the strongest year for new office development in Dublin since the global financial crisis in 2022. And we'll have a similar amount of new development completed in 2023. So there's quite a big surge in supply of new office space, and that's really the lagged effect of business decisions that were taken probably 4 or 5 years ago before COVID. And then on the demand side, you are also experiencing a cyclical factor, and that, of course, is the slowdown in the global economy, and I suppose particularly in the tech sector. So there are many things happening, but I do think we can classify them, and it helps us to think about it when we do that.
That is helpful to break it down, and you've touched on a couple of things there. We'll return to the structural side in a moment, but on the cyclical side, in terms of supply and demand, first of all, you know, you touched on what we're seeing globally, particularly as it pertains to the tech industry. On the surface, it would seem that Ireland would be quite vulnerable to that. What are we seeing in reality?
Well, I think so, yeah. So I suppose to put numbers on it, between 2017 and 2021 inclusive, ICT accounted for just a fraction under 50% of all of the gross leasing of office space in Dublin. And then if we move into 2022, we see the figure is sharply lower. It's about 23%. So that does reflect, I think, a particular sectoral issue in the tech industry. And I suppose a number of questions arise from that. Firstly, is this likely to be sustained? In other words, is tech, going to step away from office leasing in Dublin for the next 12, 18, 24 months? My sense of it is probably not really. So I think there is a strong sense that these tech firms had recruited in anticipation of growing their own businesses, and the slowdown in the global economy meant that their ability to grow their businesses was slower than anticipated, and they'd front loaded with employment, and therefore, you know, some of them are reducing their headcount, others are freezing their headcount, and others are still recruiting, but at a slower pace. And I think that'll continue as long as the global economy is, in this sort of slower phase. But we do, at this stage, understand that business cycles come and go. That's the nature of cycles, and it won't last forever. And technology is certainly not a genie that's going to go back into its bottle. We know that. So I would expect that as we go through the business cycle and it bottoms out and then begins to pick up again, that Dublin will continue to be a focus for tech companies, and that the office leasing market will benefit from that. We'll see an increased share of tech within the take-up flow in future. In the interim, I think what is sort of interesting from a nostalgic point of view really is that we're in a way we're going back to where we were. I mean, when I started in the industry, the big takers of office space around town were professional services firms, the big solicitors and accountants and so forth, the public sector, and then the domestic banks. And, we see all of those sectors have actually stepped up their office leasing quite sharply in 2022. And it's interesting that actually, if you look at all other sectors, excluding tech, take up is back up to where it was before COVID, and is the laggard. But as I say, I would expect that tech will also pick up, but it's just going to be a while because of the front loading of employment and the unwinding of that.
John, that's a very careful choice of word there, but nostalgia, the property market is the one place where you don't want to hear the word nostalgia, because it can really be translated into, in some cases, a backward step in one way. And I understand there might be maybe a balancing, or not a correction, but certainly a balancing of supply and demand that's happening. But just before we leave the issue of office space, generally we talk in terms of supply and demand. The rhetoric and the commentary seems to have changed in the most recent month or two to grey space, which was never really a conversation outside of the industry. So you might just talk our listeners through that and why it's particularly important that we are paying attention to that at the moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Carol. And I suppose just to bottom out on the sectoral distribution of leasing activity, I suppose that whatever emotions the word nostalgia provokes in us, the point I was really trying to make was that, look, and we're lucky to have it, we have a number of sectors, and despite the perception, and I think it was an accurate perception, that tech was dominant in recent years, there has always been a good balanced distribution of office demand below that or outside of tech, and that's now coming to the fore, and I think that will serve us well in the future. In terms of the supply-demand balance, so we're still sharpening our pencil and finalising our numbers for office completions for 2022, but it'll be somewhere in around 220 or 230,000 square meters. And the question really arises is, how much take-up do you need to absorb 230,000 square meters of net additional space? And the answer, I think, is a figure that's somewhere well north of 230,000, because, of course, we know that some of the people that are taking up space are moving within the market, and they're vacating space and leaving empty space behind. So if you, for example, as an occupier, move buildings and you vacate a 5,000 square meter building to take a 10,000 square meter building, then the take-up figure that agents know and love is recorded as 10,000 square meters, but net absorption is only 5,000 square meters. That is the increase in overall occupied space. So we have to think very carefully, I think, about how we measure office demand. And I think net absorption is the critical measure, because for a given level of new supply, the higher your net absorption, the rate at which that space is occupied, the lower will be your vacancy rate, and your vacancy rate is ultimately what drives rents, and rents drive value. So, so we do have to think about churn, that is the movement within the market. And we also have to think, as you say, Carol, about grey space or subleased assigned space. And if we go back and look at some of the bigger deals in 2022, you know, we do, I think, quickly see that there was quite a lot of churn. Some of the bigger deals, I'm thinking A&L Goodbody, for example, has gone through a sort of you know, quite a complicated arrangement in moving out of its building and taking a nearby building, and then the existing building will be refurbed and it's going to move back into that. And that's going to generate quite a significant amount of office leasing in a growth sense. But when you net it all out, it's only a relatively small increase in occupied space when everything washes through. So that was one of the biggest deals of the year. So that's an example of churn. And then if we think about grey space again, we have a very good example at 28 Fitzwilliam there. So, you know, you have this company Slack that had pre-let the space, and then Slack was bought by Salesforce, and then Salesforce said, well, don't worry, we've got room in our building in Spencer Dock, and so it became available under assignment. And that now has added, you know, from memory, about 12,500 square meters to the take-up figure for 2022, but it doesn't add an iota to leased space or occupied space, at least financially occupied space, because it was already let. So my take on it really, Carol, is that you know, you probably need well over 400,000 square meters of take-up in order to absorb 220 or 230,000 square meters of net additional space. And are we going to get that in 2023? I don't think so. Yeah. So what does it all mean? It means that the vacancy rate, which has already picked up, you know, quite an amount since pre-COVID, I think the vacancy rate is going to continue to pick up. But the real important thing here is to recognize that there isn't the potential for the vacancy rate to rise catastrophically as it did way back during the GFC, for example. And the simple reason for that is that there just isn't the same pipeline of office space under completion. As I say, we had a relatively big year in 2022. It'll be something similar, we think, in 2023, but then the pipeline tapers off quite sharply. And I suppose the reason why we don't have that big pipeline and this time around really reflects the way that development is funded. You know, if we go back to the bad old days and there was just so much bank funding, that those days are gone, and you know, there was much less debt capital available to do that. So there was just fewer speculatively developed schemes, and that's why I think the overhang is not going to be as great this time, or anything like it. So
there's a lot of factors feeding into this, and I fully appreciate and thank you for breaking it down, because you're right. When we look at supply, we need to be appreciative of the nuance, and I understand what you're saying there about maybe net absorption being the correct metric, but then I suppose if we break down demand into the different nuances, then actually we're looking at there's the square footage demand, and then there's demand for certain type that might be, you know, headquarter type that is of a standard. And then suddenly we're getting into a situation where actually a lot of our existing stock was built before 2014, so therefore has legacy issues that, you know, that might not fit the type of demand. So I fully appreciate that, but that brings us almost to the construction side of it. And I know together with your team there at BNP Paribas that you recently issued the latest construction PMI. So you might just talk our listeners through that.
Yeah, well, the PMI is a sort of a standard metric that is produced in hundreds of countries, across the world. The fieldwork is done by S&P Global, and they do the fieldwork here for us in Ireland as well. And we use the same methodology all over the world. And it's a simple survey. I think there's 10 or 11 simple questions. It's administered to about 150 construction firms every month. And the main indicator is based on a very simple question. In the current month, are you busier, less busier, or more busy than you were a month ago? And that then forms the basis for the index. The index is simply the percentage of firms that are saying they're busier than last month, and half of the percentage of firms that are saying they're about the same.
And where do we stand now as we kind of start into 2023?
Yeah, well, the index stands at 43.2, and anything below 50 indicates that activity is contracting month on month. And I suppose it's probably more informative to look at the trend. You know, if we go back to the start of 2022, the year opened very strongly, and you had, you know, between January and May, successive months of month-on-month expansion. So quite strong expansion in the sector in that first half. And then from mid-year, we began to see the opposite. The activity levels tapered off, and the year actually finished quite weakly. As I say, anything below 50 denotes contraction, and we're at 43.2, and the last 3 months in succession were below 50. So that has been an issue, and I suppose, you know, where is it a matter of concern? Well, probably not so much in offices, for example, that we've just talked about, you know, because as we've discussed, you know, the amount that we're building is probably running a little bit ahead at this point of the economy's capacity to absorb it within a single calendar year. So we're probably building enough office space for now, and as a result of that, as I say, office construction is going to taper off after 2023. And that's appropriate and correct, because we will have the market, you know, supplied with as much office space as it needs, at least based on a simple quantum. Carol, as you say, there is a nuance to that in terms of the spec of the stock. Maybe talk about that separately. But then where are there areas where we would maybe like to see more construction? And of course, residential is one of those areas where people are very keen to see an expansion of output. And probably, I would say, in industrial and logistics property as well. I think, you know, the vacancy rate is very thin in that market, and therefore we probably would like to see, it probably signifies that we should be building more. And there is a pipeline there that will sustain us through the remainder of this year and hopefully beyond.
I know the last time we spoke, we focused quite a bit on the logistics side, and certainly that in the early part of 2022, that was gearing up to be the star performer. How did that round out 2022, and what are your expectations for the next 12 months?
Yeah, well, that market, as I say, is really the occupier demand for logistics space is really strong. Now, it's often characterized as being driven by e-commerce, and I'm not sure that really is the driver. To my mind, the driver for logistics space is the consumption of goods. So Ireland isn't a big country for producing stuff. So most of the movement of goods relates to the consumption of goods. And what drives the consumption of goods? Well, it's the number of people multiplied by how much they consume. And on the first of those elements, the number of people, according to the latest labour force survey, at least, population growth has shot up to 112,000 people per annum. That's in the 12 months to the end of September. So that is just a really, really rapid rate of population growth. And because people need stuff, it follows that there's going to be a consequential increase in the demand for logistics infrastructure, and the logistics property market is just feeling the benefits of that.
And is this one sector that is vulnerable to our ever increasing cost of living?
Well, in the sense, Carol, that
people's disposable income, because consumerism is at quite a high in terms of, if the cost of living continues to increase, will people, will people reduce consumption, and is that like to have an impact? Just at the weekend, I know the UK version of the Sunday Times reported on Amazon closing facilities in the middle of in the Midlands. So I'm just wondering, is that something that is likely to happen in Ireland?
Well, I think it's very likely that as price inflation builds, the people have to trim their expenditure. But does that mean a reduction in the physical volume of goods? Because that's what ultimately drives the demand for warehousing space. I'm not so sure. First of all, you have the offset from population growth. So, in a small country with a population of 5.1 million, you now have 112,000 people whose consumption needs have to be serviced through our logistics network that weren't here a year ago. So that's the first thing, and that somehow, I think, offsets any squeeze on personal consumption expenditure. The other thing is, of course, what we often do when our finances are squeezed, or we substitute cheaper brands. So instead of going to a designer fashion store to buy a pair of jeans, what we might do is we might go to Penny's and buy a pair of jeans. But the jeans still have to be warehoused, and they still occupy the same physical space, whether they're a dear pair or a cheapo pair. So
there's almost a larger conversation that needs to happen there around the circular economy and our really quite gross consumerism, but that's a kind of a conversation for another day. But I suppose before we finish up, John, because I always appreciate the insights you bring, building on the data that you're working with there, in terms of your own client base, what kind of trends are you talking to them about maybe for 2023?
Yeah, well, what we're saying really is, look, in terms of in investment markets, we do expect it to be a quieter year than in previous years, and it's a matter really of looking for the opportunities that exist. Often those opportunities will be related, I think, to demographic growth. So it's no secret, and I'm sure many other agencies are working on the same basis as well. Defensive sectors of retail, like grocery, of course, those assets will be chased hard. We've seen a big shift in retail investment into the regions. And, a lot of capital has flown into regional retail investments because, given the population growth that's distributed all across the country, people need stuff. Logistics, clearly, well underpinned by demand for exactly the same reason, although it has become quite sharply priced, and it has become harder for investors to get that. I think that investors will be looking, of course, always for core office developments in Dublin, in the best city centre locations. They always want that, but those are becoming harder to buy. We do have a pipeline of development that makes opportunities flow, but that pipeline, as I say, will have, you know, done most of its work by the end of this year, and it'll be retreating somewhat after that. So I suppose the question is, what is the appetite for investors to, you know, to buy value add offices that they can seek to reposition? That's made much harder by the increases in construction costs that we've seen in recent years. And again, our CPI, our PMI index is really helpful in that regard. You know, we've seen very strong increases in construction costs, but that construction price inflation is now clearly receding and coming back to levels that might make people jump in and bite the bullet and do those refurbs. And I think there will be opportunities there, but it's not every asset that will be suitable for this, and people will be looking at the bones of the building and the floor to ceiling clearance, and they'll be looking at the locations very carefully as well. So those PRS, again, it's been hugely popular. A huge amount of capital has been attracted into it, but obviously the increase in interest rates along with construction costs make that just a harder model to operate.
Yeah, there's a lot there to take on board, and I think, you know, we say it seems to be every year we look at the uncertainties in the marketplace. This year they seem to be maybe not as uncertain as last year, but perhaps more on the negative side, that there's definitely a case of portfolio owners looking at the I suppose the demands that are there and how they're changing. We still don't know. I mean, in terms of, certainly take it back, not necessarily logistics, but certainly into kind of other areas of the commercial market. You know, there are still behavioral impacts that we don't fully understand post-COVID, you know, in terms of the remote works, how that's going to pan out. I think these are issues that are still unfolding, and I think 2023 will be an interesting year to see that. But look, my thanks as always for joining us and for breaking that down. It's always so helpful and I appreciate it. That was John McCartney, Director and Head of Research at BNP Paribas Real Estate in Ireland. We need to take a quick break. Stay tuned.